we have everybody seated? Is there anyone upstairs? No. Okay. Is someone waiting upstairs to help? Yes. Okay, great. Good evening. Bonsoir, Tanzi. It's really a pleasure to see this room. We have a few people that are working their way through security, but we think it's probably better to start just 5 minutes behind schedule. And they will, I'm sure, join us quietly, and they will be most welcome. Your Excellency, Rez Sheikh Mo, High Commissioner of South Africa, distinguished members of the Diplomatic Corps, esteemed Senate colleagues, including the Honorable Kim Pate, who's co-hosting with me this evening, valued members of academia from Canada, South Africa, and other institutions across the world, valued representatives of civil society, and the crucial agencies that support civil society. All protocols observed with you, our honored guests. I welcome you to the Senate of Canada, and I bring regrets from our co-host, Senator Rosemary Moody, co-chair of the Black Parliamentary Caucus, who, in her words, is sick with germs gifted to her by her beloved baby grandson. I'm Marilou McPhedran. I'm an independent senator from Manitoba, and I recognize that I live on Treaty 1 territory, the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene First Nations, and the homeland of the Red River Métis Nation. Je tiens à souligner que le Parlement du Canada est situé sur le territoire algonquin Anishinaabe, non cédé et non restitué. Je tiens également à souligner que les nombreuses personnes débattue sur l'île de la Tortue se joignent à nous aujourd'hui, qu'elles soient situées sur des terres cédées et non cédées. Thank you for joining us for this moment in history. In her story, a significant conversation we're quite sure is the first such discussion to meld perspectives and experiences as we are this evening in the Senate of Canada. It's a significant conversation because it is the opening session of this international symposium celebrating 30 years since South Africa's interim constitution and the enduring partnership between Canadian and South African advocates for gender equality. Those who played a role in getting us here are too numerous to name individually, but permit me to acknowledge two women in particular whose dedication, organization, and drive made this event possible. Dr. Shireen Hassim of Carleton University here in Canada, and Dr. Kathy Alberton of Wits University, South Africa. It took the Senate of Canada 153 years to reach gender parity in 2020. According to the UN, there are currently only 30 countries where women serve as head of state or government. At current rates of progress, it will take 130 years to reach parity. In our House of Commons and at the parliamentary level globally, only about 27% of elected members are women. Often, there is a difference in the lived experiences of men and women. But perpetuation of patriarchal institutions is not limited to those who identify as male. Even though we are in a phase of backlash, the evidence is clear that diverse inclusion is beneficial in policy and lawmaking, and gender parity is worth achieving. The representation of women's interests is not only about the number of women in a legislature, but also about the presence of legislators of all genders who will work to represent women's rights, with female politicians more likely to be the legislators who act on behalf of women. Research has shown that male legislators' advocacy on women's rights increases as the voices of women in legislatures are amplified. Anecdotal evidence, i.e. my experience over the past 8 years in this place where I work, demonstrates the positive impact of gender-sensitive and gender-inclusive action when senators come from diverse backgrounds and geography. Thank you, merci, Miigwech, for joining us this evening. Let us begin. I'd like now to call upon my co-host, Senator Kim Pate, for words of welcome.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Marilou, and welcome here. I have the privilege and responsibility of living here in the unceded, unsurrendered territory of Algonquin Anishinaabe. I'm very much looking forward to meeting those of you I haven't had the privilege of meeting before. And any of you who know Marilou, when she says co-host, it means you're here and you're part of it, but really this is the lead. And so I make no pretense that this is an area of my expertise, aside from some of the work we've tried to do in Canada. And it's not lost on me that this is a historic, unique, very important opportunity that we're having tonight and moving into the next few days. And I apologize, I'm off to Mi'kma'ki tomorrow morning because I had made a commitment to do some work in Halifax and then in Charlottetown. So I am very sorry I will miss those pieces, but I look forward to hearing about what happens. And, you know, as many of you know, next year marks 40 years since equality was supposed to have been proclaimed in our charter. And those of you who know our constitutional journey, at that time in 1982, it was recognized we didn't have equality, race or gender equality. And so the equality provisions didn't come into force for 3 years. So next year will be the 40th anniversary of them coming into force. I'd like to think we will sometime get there sometime before the 80th anniversary of that provision, but we're still a work in progress. And so I very much look forward to hearing about the experiences in South Africa, but also beyond, and continuing to build the alliances that have been so rich and welcomed in that Marilou has brought and that many of you have brought to the work that I do as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kim. I'd now like to ask Dr. Shireen Hassim to make welcoming remarks.
Thank you. Members of the Diplomatic Corps, High Commissioner, parliamentarians, friends and comrades, thank you so much for joining us in this event, which, as you heard, is the opening of a conference to reflect theoretically and practically on the ways in which gender equality gender equality was and is continuing to be articulated and struggled for in South Africa and Canada, and together to imagine new democratic futures. It is, as we've heard, 30 years since the formal end of that iniquitous system of apartheid, ended, of course, mainly by the people of South Africa, but dependent too on the solidarity and friendship of people across the world, not least people in Canada. It's also been 30 years of a continuing and quite vibrant activism in South Africa to give meaning to the very powerful clauses in the South African Constitution, the crafting of which was the project, I would say, the central project of hope for the country as it began to think about what would replace apartheid. Hope that through our actions, through our political will, we would make a better world. That in fact, South Africa would lead the way for the new wave of democracy. We shared that hope with feminists in Canada, who had themselves, as Senator Pate has just said, themselves been fighting just a decade before us to ensure that equality provisions for women would be included in the Canadian Constitution. 35 years ago, there were open and generous and hard-hitting and clear-eyed, I would say, conversations between feminists from both countries when we debated how best to include and to word constitutional language in which we identified every possible pitfall, every possible ally, and every possible enemy of the project in both these countries, learning from each other, and meeting to really pay attention to the kind of language we were crafting, because we knew once it is in the Constitution, it'll become the basis for action. I want to thank at this moment the IDRC, particularly Mark van Meringen, who was then the country representative who poured so much of his energy and resources into funding those meetings. And you know, some of those very people are here in the room today. We will recognize each other. And we are continuing what is, in fact, a very long conversation and hoping to rebuild hope in a time when it seems to be very scarce to find. I have to say that community of imagination, that community of thinking is so beautifully represented in this original artwork done for our project by this stalwart of the anti-apartheid movement, Margaret Adam, who is here in the room today. This merging of a maple leaf and a protea that also reminds us that feminism has sharp edges and we need to keep them sharp. Thank you to Marilou, McPhedran, Rosemary Mead, and Kim Pate for hosting the discussion and the reception, and especially Senator McPhedran, who was with us at the beginning of the constitutional talks and is here still. Thank you. Thank you to the marvelous Pam Palmater for honoring us by foregoing other international invitations, much more important in some respects, to be with us feminists on the ground today. Thank you. Thank you to our steadfast friend, Susan Basili, for making the long journey to be here from Geneva, to also being very involved in planning the conference. And then finally, Kathy and I would like to thank our respective research chairs for funding this conference, the Canada 150 research chair in my case, in Kathy's case, the South African research chair. And Kathy's going to say a couple of words now.
C'est un grand honneur d'être ici au Sénat canadien à l'ouverture de notre conférence sur l'égalité au Canada et en Afrique du Sud. C'est aussi le moment de faire une pause et de reconnaître la solidarité entre nos deux nations. In that respect, and with all due protocol observed, and echoing the thanks of Shireen to everyone present and to Marilou in particular, it is quite wonderful that the opening of this conference is being hosted in the Canadian Senate for a number of reasons. Firstly, because, quite frankly, women should be at the center of national institutions. Gender equality is a global and a national issue. So the symbolism of it, I think, is incredibly important. Linked to that, both Marilou and Shireen have spoken about the struggles of women in the 1980s to secure that powerful language in the Canadian Constitution, in your Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And that activism of Canadian feminists, especially around your Section 15, was to become a very powerful source of inspiration for South African feminists a decade later. Indeed, we drew very heavily on your scholarship and your activism as we formulated our own equality clause as we wrote academic treatises as to how it should be interpreted, and as we watched the court take up at least some of that scholarship. And I think there's a direct line between feminism in Canada, feminism in South Africa, and the jurisprudence of the Constitutional Court. It's our Constitutional Court. It's often a thin line, but it's a golden line, and we must keep that golden line, and we must make it stronger. And I do think the maple leaf is without doubt woven into the fabric of our constitutional equality journey. But since then, in the past decades, our equality pathways have followed quite different trajectories, and we'll hear a lot more about that tomorrow morning when we have a conversation between Marilou and Kate O'Regan, who was our Constitutional Court judge. And maybe we've parted ways in more ways than we should. So I think we have to take this moment to renew ourselves, to learn from each other, and to be energized as we take our struggles forward and build that elusive vision of substantive equality that we all imagined. What would it be 40 years ago for you and 30 years ago for us? So you're middle-aged, we're not quite there yet. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kathy. It's now a great pleasure to turn this over to His Excellency for remarks.
Wow, you just heard two very powerful women from South Africa. And I'm wondering how am I going to match that? But let me just take this opportunity to recognize Mona Abu Amara from the delegation of Palestine. Thank you so much for coming. I think much of this will also be of enormous help to you in the time in which you are in need of desperate hope from us. Sabah, thank you very much for coming. Sabah is the ambassador of Jordan. She's here. And again, two women. I wonder where are all our other colleagues, especially the men, but we'll come to that. So we are 30 years in our democracy, our constitutional democracy. We're not just a democracy. We are a constitutional democracy in which all our lives are governed by. As you've heard, much of the development of our constitution, we borrowed extensively from Canada. So much so that I end up marrying a Canadian. So I just want to acknowledge, my partner who's in the room, not because she's my partner, but because she comes from the IDRC. So thank you very much. She is invited in her own right here, but I thought I would acknowledge her or else I would be in trouble back home. So the IDRC helped us in enormous ways. And if I remember well, and I'm trying to think about Alison Redford, and I think Alison Redford did make some trips to South Africa and facilitated a lot of dialogue between the IDRC, between the Albertine legal firm, Cheadle Thompson, and many of us who were coming from what people called Mona, what people call terrorist, but we were then declared. And we had to learn all these things, and Canada, and particularly the IDRC, were at the forefront of helping us to understand the requirements of a democracy. And we borrowed extensively from the Constitution of Canada, even in my own speciality, previously, not anymore, please, I'm not involved in foreign interference. I was the previous head of intelligence, and we borrowed from the construct of Canadian intelligence system, and we brought that also into our constitution. So in our constitution, we have elements that you had in law in respect of Canada. Of course, we parted ways because you've changed all of those arrangements and we are stuck with them, but for the better, I must say. And I'm wondering whether in the recent discussions that are going on in the newspapers, whether it would be useful to have retained many of the mechanisms that you have walked away from. So we learned a lot from you. And I remember, and Shireen is being very polite and very modest here, she was a student activist with me at University of Durban, Westville. And the women activists kept reminding us that what we suffer in South Africa is triple oppression. One, because of our color and racism. Two, because you are women. And three, because you are workers. So because of the triple oppression, women played an extraordinary role in our liberation. So when I was looking at the theme of this discussion, imagining inequality in Canada and South Africa, my mind went first and foremost with the general inequality that exists during apartheid and is perpetuated in our democracy because we are unable to grapple with these new forms of capitalism to ensure that we get the kind of equality that we so desire. So today we are one of the most, what is the word, unequal societies in the world, in South Africa. Our women, under 30 years of democracy, still suffer from gender-based violence, which is an issue that has to be resolved, and our government is doing a hell of a lot to grapple with the ideas or what is to be done to reverse this. And I think it comes to the matters that Aaron and I were discussing on our way here. And that is the issue of agency. And how do we produce agency? How do we get every one of us at an individual level to make the changes that we want to see? Collectively, all of us in this room brought an end to apartheid because racism was a terrible thing. Well, we need that kind of agency today, not only for the women of Canada, but for the women of Palestine. We need that agency for all of the women wherever they are. Because unless that changes, and this is not only a women's struggle, this is a people's struggle. This is a struggle of all of us. In order to change this, and I can tell you in my country that it is no longer cool to listen to jokes that are, sexist, that are jokes that crosses the line. Because once we start to tolerate those things, we then start to tolerate our own oppression in the end. So viva to the women, viva to you guys. Keep this struggle going. Keep reminding governments what they need to do. Keep reminding governments how to fund the kind of research that is necessary. And let's just make our world a little better than what it is. And each of us have agency to do that. Please don't stop believing in hope. Mona, you in particular. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. That's very, yes. I'll just mention that if anybody's feeling squeezed where there are, we have several chairs at the table, and you're certainly welcome to move if you wish to do so. This now takes us to the point where we're going to try a bit of an experiment. We decided that speeches from podiums weren't really going to work that well for this evening. So we're going to do a fairly iterative conversation. And I would like to ask, as part of that, if I could welcome remarks from Dr. Susan Basili, the director of the International Women's Rights Project, and as was mentioned, We got her here early this morning from Geneva, and I think we have her here for a couple of days, and then she's off again on mission. Susan.
Thank you. Thank you, Marilou. I learned to say when I was in South Africa, all protocols observed. So I'm saying that now. It is incredibly moving to be in this room, in the Senate, with all of you, and to see so many familiar faces. We're here to celebrate. We're here to acknowledge these various anniversaries. I just want to give a little bit of a context, though, to what our shared collective and collaborative solidarity has been between Canadian and South African feminists. It's a reflective process, but it's not about nostalgia. It's about what we learn from building on the lessons that we've shared. But going back these 30, 35 years, I was making a list of all the things we've collaborated on together. Putting women on the agenda in 1990, to Liz's conference in Ottawa, 1989, I think, to the working forum, I remember, Kathy, we were trying to learn how to skate on the frozen canal, Canadian women trying to learn how to toy in South Africa. The Malabongwe conference, CODESA, these obviously aren't in chronological order. The Durban conference. The biggest social mobilization in Canadian history of women was the 1981 Ad Hoc Committee on Women and the Constitution. The Women's National Coalition organizing all across South Africa for the Women's Charter. The democratic elections. And in 2006, we had, again, a reflective period. It was 16 years since putting women on the agenda, another partnership with Kathy at CALS at JITS with IWRP, where we changed the name, putting women on the agenda, to putting feminism on the agenda, and looked back over what had transpired over the past 16 years on equality rights for women in South Africa. And in the same year, we celebrated and acknowledged the 25 years since the Ad Hoc Committee on Women and the Constitution, out of which I made a film, which is circulating around here. There's copies for people to take if you want. Shireen's book, Contesting Authority, came out in 2006, and the Zuma rape trial, which led to the formation of 1 in 9, a feminist activist organization on violence against women in South Africa that has been incredibly inspirational. I went back and read the papers from 2006, and because I had a very delayed flight, I got to read all the papers for the conference over the next 2 days on the plane and in the airport. And what I'm really mindful of is, as much as we talk about jurisprudence and we're talking about constitutional language and we talk about drafting litigation, what we're all talking about is movement building, is the women's movements in our two countries and the activism that has led to what has created the lived rights of women in constitutions around the world. I want to skip over some of my notes because I have too much here to say, but I also want to acknowledge that the relationship between Canada and South Africa is much, much more historical. That the history of apartheid began with the history of the Indian reservation system in Canada, the Indian Act that led to the Bantustan system, the pass laws, and the history of apartheid in South Africa. And that relationship goes far, far back. And there are other things that we share that we are all experiencing the legacies of. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, which mostly invisibilized women. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada that mostly invisibilized women, which led to, in many ways, the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Inquiry. I was in Geneva with Sharon McIver, leading a delegation on Monday of the largest delegation of Indigenous women in Canadian history going to CEDAW. Today, Canada is reporting to CEDAW. And there are 40 women's organizations representing Canada talking about the fact that, amongst many other things, of the 231 recommendations in the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women Inquiry, 2 have been implemented. 2 have been implemented. I don't even know how many of the TRC calls for action have been implemented.
And in my work with the UN, because now I'm working mired in authoritarian regimes and dealing with dictators and preparing evidence for the International Criminal Court, and seeing the obliteration of civil society in Belarus, in Russia, and what's happening in Ukraine. And I attend the Human Rights Council to hear the Special Rapporteur in Palestine talk about what's happening in Palestine, the absolute devastation and the genocide that is happening in Palestine. And for us in Canada, genocide, Article 2 of the Convention, is language that was used to describe the situation of what's happening to Indigenous women in our country. Mo, you mentioned hope. Hope is a word I think we all try and hang on to. But what gives me hope is being in this room, is seeing the legacy of many of the activists here who've been doing this work all their lives, and we will all continue to do it. And another inspiration of hope, I think, is to celebrate the resilience and the resistance of feminists, of activists, and particularly of Indigenous women. I come to you from the unceded territory of the Squamish, the Tsleil-Waututh, and the Musqueam people. I am grateful to be here on Algonquian territory, and I am exceedingly honored to be able to introduce Pam Palmater to address you now.
Thank you. Bonjour tout le monde. Hello. It's historic today, and it's also a great honor, and all protocols observed, and especially to our representative from Palestine. I am only here because of feminists. The work I do has been led by feminists. It has been informed by feminists. I go to places I don't want to go because of feminists. I am torn in multiple directions, and I'm sure all of our feminist friends in Geneva, Sheila Day, Gwen Brodsky, Sharon McIver, and everyone else will forgive me because I'm here today. They've got things locked down there. So this really is historic for me because not too often people ask Indigenous women about solidarity at an international level. But for Indigenous peoples from all over the world, we have been working in solidarity for decades. It doesn't get reported on. You don't hear it in the media. It's probably not going to be in the history books until we write the history books. But we have been doing so much, whether it's the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, whether it's advocating for the women and children and everybody in Palestine, for all the work we've done all over the world to advocate for an end to genocide, because we know what that feels like. And so Indigenous women bring a very different perspective in the sense of it's a reminder of, even when we have formal equality in the sense of our charter and our constitution, section 15, we have a equality. And in many ways, you know, women's rights have been advanced. But if you measure it from Indigenous women's perspectives, that's not the case. We still have a country who argues against equality for women in the Indian Act. And we had a whole national inquiry on murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls, and it dropped out of the media in a week. We're still talking about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission for Indian residential schools, the water settlement, I mean, everything you can imagine. But the whole conversation around murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls, the genocide, the historic and ongoing, has just dropped off the radar. And I think something else that really isn't being picked up is what Indigenous women are doing on the front lines for advocating for the women and children in Palestine. We were some of the first people to speak out, and you can imagine the wrath that came back for doing that. But it's putting ourselves out there. And when people keep saying, well, that's none of your business, why are you talking about that? And I always think about all of our elders talk about women as mothers, you know, Mother Earth, mothers for children and grandchildren. And one elder said to me that mothers and women are effectively the mothers of humanity. And so as women, we are out there saying we have to take care of all of our children, all of our grandchildren, all over the world. And to me, that has always stuck with me. I can hardly say it without feeling very emotional, but mothers are called to advocate and to protect wherever they're needed. And sometimes it's between Indigenous peoples in Canada and South Africa, or Palestine, or in Mexico, or in South America, wherever there is a need, especially for women and children, obviously for all of humanity. But to me, it is such an unrecognized, I don't even want to say movement, but it's an element of humanity that gets erased or not even written down in the history books. You think about the Constitution, and you know, you're talking about the male ministers, and you're talking about the male prime minister and other people. But what about the many, many women that worked towards that? What about the Constitution, where there was all of these Indigenous women saying, not only do we need this equality provision, but in the provision that we have that protects Indigenous rights, that must specifically say equality between men and women, or else we're going to be left out. In the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, we specifically advocated to say it's for male and female Indigenous peoples, because we can't take it for granted. We can't even assume that Indigenous women are going to be a part of this. So it's one of those things where I'm so honored. I didn't even know that I would be on this path, or that feminism was such a powerful and beautifully infectious part of a legacy and a movement that is already within Indigenous women. Traditionally, pre-contact, people think, you know, the men were the warriors and the women were taking care of the children. And we were taking care of children, but we were also hunting and providing for people. And if our men were away hunting and we were attacked, women were on the front lines. We were warriors too. And so the elders say effectively, women and feminists are natural born warriors, because you have to be in order to protect humanity. And so being a part of this is so important, because it's how we understand our constitutions. Unlike some other countries, we are an unwritten constitution of nations. So we have recognized so far a constitution of the nation of Canada, but we still have a long ways to go to recognize all of the sovereign nations within Canada and within the United States as well. They're on a different level altogether. So to me, all of this, we could have as many laws as we want to. We do. We have the Charter of Rights. We have Section 35 protecting Indigenous rights. We have the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. We have laws for the prevention and punishment of genocide. We have laws against crimes against humanity and war crimes and all of these things. So if the world acted by what they commit to, if they were as committed to the rule of law as they profess in political speeches, we wouldn't have this situation in Palestine or in the Sudan or in other places. Because when it comes down to it, you can paint yourself as a democratic country or one that's committed to the rule of law and human rights. But if you are not following the law, abiding by the law, if you can ignore the International Court of Justice or the International Criminal Court, or ignore what special rapporteurs are saying at the United Nations and allow a genocide to appear for the very first time on social media, like there's no doubt about it. We're not finding out about it 20 years after the fact and reading about it in history books. You can literally watch it on social media. And to not act is a sign to me that, boy, the world needs feminists more than they've ever needed feminists.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm good for now. I will calm down. We can carry on the conversation.
I'm going to take a moment just to acknowledge the team of people, mostly young people who work directly with my Director of Parliamentary Affairs. And to just say that one of the reasons that we're able to do this kind of event, well, I really miss academia, I have to tell you. I really miss teaching and students. So we've actually created in my office a parliamentary learning lab. It's very difficult for young people to learn anything really about Parliament. So both Senator Pate and I, Kim and I, are very delighted to be able to host interns, primarily from the University of Ottawa Law School, but not exclusively. And one of the things that I've realized working happily, very happily working with a range of young people in my office, we're over 70 young people that have come through my office here in the Senate as interns. But I also am somehow shocked anew each time I realize they're not being taught any of this. Marry 2 acts early. Claire Leroux Dubé. You know, the Sandra Lovelace, former senator, with her sister, who was the very first complaint to go to the United Nations and started the process, which is still ongoing, of trying to clean up the Indian Act. And so this kind of opportunity for us to be together and have this conversation and to be inspired, I want to acknowledge Margie and the artwork that has inspired the whole meeting with the maple leaf and the protea, the 2 countries. And I also want to just note that I'm wearing a mariposa or a papillon or a butterfly. And that indeed was the whole symbol of the women's social movement to try to strengthen the Canadian Constitution. These are the DVDs that you're very welcome to pick up if you wish, for some history, produced in 2006 out of the 25th conference, looking at women's constitutional activism in Canada, in South Africa, and in Afghanistan at a time, and Rwanda, at a time when we thought we were on a trajectory that we're not actually on. And I too want to thank IDRC, because it was IDRC that was the first to come in to support the conference on women's constitutional activism in all of these countries, and made it possible for us to bring women activists here to Ottawa to have that conversation. And there are moments, you know, in our times together when we reflect on what has been achieved. And one point I'll make is that there are 2 notwithstanding clauses in the Constitution of Canada. One, of course, is Section 33 that we hear all about, but the other clause that begins notwithstanding anything in this charter is Section 28, which is the clause that articulates equality between male and female persons. And that kind of social activism, political activism, issue focused, so that this is the kind of opportunity that is seized by civil society in particular, and often parliamentarians become influenced or inspired by civil society. Doesn't start in government. And when we're having this conversation, I think one of the points that that we looked at earlier today, just informally, was about disappearance. And how you can have, it's not because there was no documentation of the social activism building the Constitution in this country. It's there. It's in media coverage. It's in various articles. In 2008, I sat down and wrote an article for the Supreme Court Law Review that was called A Truer Story on Constitutional Trialogue, because the prevailing legal constitutional scholar opinion, led primarily by my former professor, the wonderful late Peter Hogg, was that it was a dialogue. That it was a dialogue that happened between governments and the courts, completely leaving out civil society, engagement, leadership, much of the early drafting, the improvements in drafting undoubtedly came from civil society in Canada. And we know that women have been on the ground engaged in constitutional activism post-conflict. It's a pattern that we see. And then we see years later, if it manages to survive, and some, like Afghanistan, have not, a disappearance. And those of us here who have connections to academia, I think we want to ask ourselves about that disappearance and what function does that serve? How interesting that it becomes a compelling need to disappear what is documented. So I want to toss that out and invite response and comments.
Am I on? Okay. Okay, now that I'm calm and more professional. Yeah, so the disappearance of women, think about just that terminology, what it means in so many contexts. So the enforced disappearances of women all over the world, murdered or missing, disappeared women all over the world, but also from history books. You can literally see, we were talking earlier, pictures, historical pictures of a man who's advocating for something. And there could be 8 women standing beside him, no names for the women that were there at major conventions, at major moments in history, be it in Canada or in other countries. And so without a name, that's like a disappearance. Who is going to talk about that? What about the famous 5? I actually mentioned the famous 5 in my classroom the other day, and they're like, what? Who? Yeah. Is that like a sports team? Is that a new band? Is that someone on TikTok? And it's like, no, it's these women who took all of these risks. And I think this disappearance is another reason why we have to be so vocal as feminists to make sure it gets documented, which is why I am so glad that in the academic world, I'm in academics too, we are publishing and researching as fast as humanly possible. We are the ones that are editing history books. We are doing all of this now so that it can't get erased, right? Because we have to leave that legacy so that people will know what we worked hard for. Because unfortunately, there's also this movement in the world, this very populist pushback against equal rights for women, against, anti-racism movements, everything we thought we had established, not so much. Even me, I have to say, when I was younger and I learned about the Convention Against Genocide, for the prevention and punishment of genocide, I thought, thank goodness that can't happen again, because the whole motto of that is never again. What a relief that that can't happen. And then when you grow up and you're exposed to the world and you meet people like Alex Neve, who's saying, oh, well, let me tell you something about this law and what's happening around the world. And it's just like, oh, we just need feminists so much more so that we aren't disappeared, so that our sons and their sons see that we are the warriors that we are, that when we talk about women and the warriorness in women, we're not saying this poor victim over here. We're saying, look at this warrior who was able to change more in a short period of time than governments have in decades. Think about people like Cindy Blackstock. Oh my goodness, from the Gitxsan Nation. But for her dogged determination to fight for the equality of First Nations children in foster care and to consistently hold Canada to account, we wouldn't be at the negotiating table now. There's lots of male politicians who want to take credit for that, but she has been out there. She took kids to the United Nations. She bakes cookies and takes kids to court so that kids can be a witness to what's happening in court, so that they can see, look at our women in action. And you look at people like Cher McIver. Cher McIver is literally the grandmother to probably 100,000 Native people in Canada now, because she too kept fighting sex inequality in the Indian Act and kept fighting and kept fighting. Canada tried to buy her off. She's like, no, I'm good. No, we'll give you your status. No, I'm good. I'm fighting for everybody else. When she wasn't appreciated by male politicians, when she wasn't welcome in meetings, when people were even threatening her, she's like, no, I'm just going to continue on and continue on and continue on. She was able to accomplish more than any of our political or government organizations have on that issue. And you can go right on down the line and see these major issues being led by women. So I don't know more. I'm so glad you talked about disappearing women from this activist and feminist stage, because I don't know more, for anyone who doesn't know, was the largest social movement in Canadian history. It lasted for months, and it was led by a small group of Indigenous women. We all just happened to be lawyers, saying, okay, what the government's doing, it is going to roll back time on equality, on anti-racism, on environmental protections, and we need to do something about this. None of us set up an organization. None of us applied for funding anywhere. We didn't patent anything. We were just like, okay, organically, we need to work with Canadians and tell the government this isn't good. And it lasted for months, and there were more Canadians on the front lines with us than ever in history. And that came from women, even if we never remember their names, it was women leading the I Don't Know More movement. And who stands in front of all of the bulldozers to protect our ancient forests? It's probably going to be women. Who is prominent in terms of land defense? It's going to be women. Look at Ellen Gabriel. When she was very, very young, she's from the Mohawk Nation. She was standing face to face with Canada's military. Military had invaded our territory. And she was this calm, much calmer than I am, cool and collected person who was chosen not just by the politicians, but also by her traditional leaders to be the spokesperson, to try to ensure the safety of her people. And so, these are individual women, obviously surrounded by lots of people and allies. I could name a million of them, like Senator McPhedran and Senator Pate and so many people. But they're making sure that our children know it was Indigenous women who were doing that, so that the next generation, when we pass on, the attempted erasure isn't effective. Because I think this pushback would hope that they can scare us and threaten us and attack us enough to not be in politics, to not be in Senate, to not be journalists anymore, and to not be activists, because that's what's happening right now. If you speak out against things, we're threatened.
Are you comfortable sharing a bit more about what you're actually going through right now because of the positions you're taking? I think the kind of harassment that many of us live with, it's probably good to speak out.
Yeah, and I don't mind speaking out because there are so many women who can't. But for example, my good friend Alex Neve, the former Secretary General of Amnesty International, and I did a live event on YouTube to talk about what's the law around genocide, crimes against humanity, all of these things in the context of what's happening to Palestinians and why we need to be taking action to end the genocide. And the kinds of threats that I got by messages and texts and social media, they weren't, I disagree with you, or you don't know the history or anything like that. It was all, yeah, well, how would you like it if, and then they'll say horrible things. We're going to come to your office and first we're going to rape you and then we're going to kill you and then we're going to burn down the office you work in. And I'm thinking, why is it always that? Why is it always first we're going to rape you? What does that have to do with what I was talking about? But in fact, it has a lot when you think about it. The very things we're fighting against. So there's a lot of people in a lot of positions that don't have the benefit. My university can have extra security. They can have panic buttons. They can have locked doors. There's a certain amount of security Not all women have this. We know some women who are just, I'm not doing politics anymore because they know where I live. They're going to come to my house. Or you get doxxed in social media where they find out where you live and harass you. We have to make sure that doesn't happen. We need women in leadership, and we need women in journalism, and we need women activists on the ground who shouldn't worry about what's coming behind them in terms of and it's almost always male violence that are threatened when we hold a rally in support of Palestine. We shouldn't be worrying about being assaulted by the men who are standing behind us, threatening to do just that.
Susan, any commentary on that?
I just wanted to go back to the erasure and talk about that this gathering is called intergenerational and international. And I wonder if you could speak to the young activists in Indigenous cultures across this country and Indigenous nations, because that is what will ensure there's no erasure. And as reading the papers I said I read for the conference the next 2 days, I was very struck by what I am learning from the young scholars and the young activists. And I'm wondering if you could speak to that, both as a teacher and as a leader in your community.
Yeah, so here's the thing about young people. You know, when you say, who do you look up to? Who is your mentor? I look at people like Sharon McIver, because ever since I was young, I was following her. But it's also important to mention all of the young people who are activists at the same time. So it's not so linear. It's not like you reach a certain stage and now you're an activist or now you're a feminist. It's something that we have been teaching. Unfortunately, we've had to teach our children about how to be activists, how to be feminists, how to create and participate in movements because of all of the issues in terms of colonization and what hasn't been addressed. So you have very, very, very young children who will stand on the front lines to protect water from contamination. And then you have the grannies, the very, very elderly people sitting in the background doing beadwork to raise money for all of the other adults who are going to be arrested and taken to jail because they're trying to protect the water. So you have 3 generations all acting as activists and as warriors, but serving very different roles. And so the kids say, you know, my granny's more hardcore than anybody I see on TV. So these young people are seeing that and knowing that the work they're doing on the front lines is to protect their grannies, but their grannies are protecting them. And so that I have grown up that way. I have 8 sisters. And when I was a very little girl, they took me to every protest, every march, every rally, every community gathering. No idea what was going on. All I knew was when I saw women crying and yelling and saying we had to do something, I knew it had to be important. And you can't teach that to people. That just gets absorbed into your soul. And so now I've made sure that my kids, you know, I was pregnant with my kids and we were going to marches and rallies and protests and so that they could see women in action. That it wasn't just about you have to be a man and you have to be elected and you have to be a political leader and that's how things get done. I would argue it's how things get slowly done. But for feminist women leaders, the children are an essential part of that. And you'll see Idle No More, kids were out doing Idle No More. They were organizing their own little marches and rallies. And like I was talking about with Cindy Blackstock, she took kids to court and to the UN because she believes, according to her tradition, kids need to grow up and see that they have a warrior role to play in defending humanity. And so all of these kids are inspiring, but we have to make sure that we're protecting them from this backlash too, because kids obviously are going to be a little bit more vulnerable than we are.
Can you just explain the African guest, Cindy Blackstock?
Yes.
And the issues you're talking about, because they don't know.
They don't know.
The children
Or the harassment of Cindy by the
Yes.
government.
And that
Oh
too.
my goodness. Oh, so much. Yeah. So Cindy Blackstock is an Indigenous woman from the Gitxsan Nation. It's in British Columbia. And she is a social worker, and she has advocated her whole life for an end to the over apprehensions of First Nation kids. So children have been taken from our families since Indian residential schools, stolen from us and put into residential schools, where many of our kids were never seen again, tortured and abused, and many of them didn't make it out alive. What's the legacy of that? The legacy of that is when residential schools started to close, then all of a sudden there was something called the 60 scoop. Well, okay, we can't put them in residential schools anymore. We're going to put them all into white families and farm them out to places all over the world so that they can't be with their families. Once that stopped, then what happened? Well, then they started being put into foster care and then adopted out. So it was like, here's the stopgap by incredible numbers. If you looked across the country, more than our children at the time were only 5% of the population, children's population, but more than 50% of the kids in foster care. And in provinces like Manitoba, 90% of all kids in foster care were Indigenous children. And then there's a pipeline. You look at all of the youth corrections, essentially prison for children. Some of them are 100% Indigenous children coming right from foster care. So she formed this organization called the First Nation Child and Family Caring Society, where she rallied the troops all over the country to put an end to kidnapping our kids and putting them into foster care situations where most of them break down and they end up going murdered and missing, or they're human trafficked, or they live on the street homeless, and we don't see them again. So even though the government didn't like her advocacy, and they followed her and they surveilled her and harassed her, wouldn't let her into buildings, tried to turn Indigenous male leaders against her, she turned it around and said, well, you know what? I'm going to make an access to information request about what it is that you're doing. Indian Affairs doesn't have a surveillance mandate. What is Indian Affairs doing surveilling people? So she encouraged other women, Indigenous women leaders, to do the same thing. So we were all filing access to information requests, and it really opened our eyes. It's not just that we're being erased, it's also that we're being surveilled and monitored so they can stop us before we can even exercise our voices. And they were found guilty of doing that and had to pay out compensation, which she donated to the cause. But that happens all across the board. We can be on RCMP's hot watch list, CIS's terror list. I mean, the Department of National Defense used to have Indigenous peoples there as insurgents and threats to national security. So it's a very aggressive form of trying to silence Indigenous women. Who wants to be caught up in that? It's a very frightening situation to be in, but Cindy did it anyway. And she is continuing to do it anyway. She's continuing to speak out, even when government would like her just to not speak out. And so, wow, it's people like that that really inspire me to keep going and that I'm learning from. And she's teaching a whole generation of kids what it means to just be fair, to make sure everyone has equality, to be nice to everybody, to follow human rights. It's just literally, yes, like, and she said, kids say it the best when something wrong is happening. Well, that's not fair. Why would we do that? Like, why would we hurt someone else? Why would we mistreat someone else? And I think sometimes adults have a lot to learn from that. And so Cindy is just one of those incredibly amazing people.
I'm going to riff off that, and I'm going to ask for comments from both of you about litigation as a tool. Because we are talking constitutions, we're talking laws and lawmaking. What are your thoughts on using strategic litigation? I mean, we have organizations represented here that have built for the anniversary from the founding of NAL, 1974, a decade later, Leaf, strategic litigation. What are your thoughts?
Well, I'm I'm mindful of what Shireen said about Liz's paper in 1990, that it was a bit morose. And then in 2006, Liz said she was being optimistic. So I think that we have learned that litigation and strategic litigation is one important tool in the toolbox, or whatever that expression is. But it's certainly not one that we can rely on. And we've certainly learned in terms of equality litigation in Canada that women very often lose, which is not to say we don't do it. If Sibogili was here, she would talk about strategic litigation in Africa and the models she's designed, the training she's doing all across Africa. We don't stop doing it because we don't win very many cases. But I'm mindful the example you were giving about Cindy, that it's just one piece of creative things that we can do. So getting the freedom of information, finding other ways. I'm mindful too of when early on, when we often felt that we weren't winning anything in criminal cases around rape, that women started looking at civil litigation. In terms of constitutional litigation for Indigenous women, I don't know what's been successful, but I think it's a piece also of why Sharon went to the UN and to the Latin American Inter-American Commission, and the women going to CEDAW again. I mean, what I learned in doing my research over the years is it's not what you get from, for example, the decision at CEDAW or the UN bodies. It's how you use it and advocate it when you come home. We have to be relentless in trying to get the courts to apply international instruments that we are signatories to.
I'm going to pause just for a moment because we're in Ottawa, and folks that spend their time in Ottawa know that on a typical evening, many of us have 4 or 5 things we have to do. And that is true of His Excellency this evening. And so to allow for a subtle exit, I'd like to offer you the opportunity to say a few words before you slip away.
I just read this, don't touch.
There you go. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I must say that I waited 3 years, a mere 3 years. I waited 3 years to hear this. It is shocking how absent in the diplomatic corps this information is, Pam. I mean, I think there's something, maybe Meredith, the IDRC could arrange a discussion of this nature so that, I think inform the diplomats. We are ignorant. I'm a fan of Tanya Talaga. I read her whenever she is in the Globe and Mail, and she's not there too often. Yeah, exactly. And I wait for her things, and there's a disconnect between what she writes about and what all the other articles about. It's as if we're living in different parallel universes, right? I mean, what you read from Tanya and then what you read from, I won't name him, let's say someone who's got the first name Andrew, it's just an incredible different universe. So please do more of this. I mean, if there's anything we can do, I'm sure Meredith will grab at the opportunity, but it'll be a fascinating dialogue. I want to apologize. I have to leave early.
I explained.
You explained. Yeah. Okay. So thank you very much. Aaron, I'll see you at home. Okay.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks so much.
It's a good time to plug Pam's podcast.
Oh my goodness.
Just just Google podcast Pam Palmater warrior.
Yeah.
So picking up on that, and I
Mhm.
also want to invite Senator Kim Pate into the conversation because so much of the work that you do involves engaging our legal systems.
Mhm.
So
Well, our prisons are full of the people that every other system fails, basically, which is, you know, the postscript to yours. I don't even know if you know this, Pam, but I just someone who was the first Indigenous deputy minister, male deputy minister in public safety, told me years ago that I Don't Know More was actually listed as a terrorist group. Oh, you did know that. Okay. So, and, you know, he and we, a number of us were up in arms. I wasn't yet in the Senate, that, you know, a completely peaceful, joyful, populist movement would get described as a terrorist group when you have then a convoy of 18-wheelers roll up on the hill and gets described as a freedom convoy. It like the fact that we have that kind of description. And I mean, I don't have much to add. I mean, as Pam said, you know, moving on from what Cindy and Pam and so many others are working on, and Sharon, is, you know, those kids who end up in care, end up in juvenile detention, end up in adult detention. And in Canada, and perhaps our international guests may not know, but 1 in 2 women in federal custody, that's meaning they're in prison for 2 years or more, is Indigenous in this country. 1 in 2, less than 5% of the population, but 1 in 2. And the majority of them are classified as maximum security. And all of those who are placed in what is currently termed structured intervention units, basically the new name for segregation or solitary confinement, in the prisons designated for women, all of the women who end up in there are Indigenous. So we have this, the pile-on effect is not only are they incarcerated at that rate, they're less likely to be released into the community. They're less likely to have access to programs. They're more likely to develop, in addition to any trauma-related mental health or addiction issues they may have, they're likely to emerge with more. And in fact, a woman that Pam and I will be presenting with in Mi'kma'ki is a woman who was diagnosed with isolation-induced schizophrenia after spending 11 years. She was a 60 scoop. She was one of the forcibly removed. And so the other thing that Cindy's doing that I think is litigation, it's been horrifying to watch the division in Indigenous communities, not surprising, but horrifying, is that, you know, what she was arguing for was not just fair, but equitable. She was a social worker who knew that if a kid was taken into care who was Indigenous, there were fewer resources, or into the healthcare system, fewer resources were applied to those children than were applied to non-Indigenous kids. And so that was the crux of her first arguments. And that's also true in, even one of the things we'll be talking about is on Prince Edward Island, the First Nations there want to reclaim the resources that are currently going to incarcerate their people. And because it's such a small island, there have been very few, well, there have been jails built, there are provincial and youth jails, but there are very few resources for people when they leave custody. And so they're talking about reimagining a different way of basically addressing those issues. Things like, they're not surprising, the first First Nations to come out in favor of things like basic income and supported resources in mental health and integrated social, economic, and health systems. So it's, you know, kudos to you for all that you've done. And yeah, I think the work will continue because, as you mentioned, right now, we think it's bad in federal custody for Indigenous women. In Saskatchewan, Manitoba, so our central provinces and the 3 northern territories, 95 to 100% of the young women and girls in custody are Indigenous. So that trajectory is getting worse. And we've done a chart that we did when we did a training session for judges 3 years ago to show that every reform we've made that is well-intentioned, every litigation agreement done by someone who doesn't know what's actually happening in the system, many great lawyers, but not necessarily well-informed on the impact of what they're doing. Every move has result, whether it's healing lodges, whether it's elders in ceremonies, whether it's special circumstance courts like Indigenous or First Nations courts, all of them have resulted in more people ending up in the system because we all feel better somehow culturally they're being taken care of. It's utter nonsense. It's not true, but it makes us feel better because resources are going there. And we're in a big fight right now to even try and hold corrections accountable. 4 different Senate committees have asked for how money has been spent by corrections. We've had 4 different answers. And the sum total was $72 million can't be accounted for. That was supposed to go into contracting mental health beds in the community to transfer people out of the prisons. So when you know they're mostly for Indigenous people, those are the kinds of, I think we need to have more intentional strategic litigation that has a clear objective of restructuring. Dismantling, yes, but restructuring, because if we don't restructure, then someone else comes up with a remedy without knowing what the impact, the unintended consequences of a well-meaning remedy might look like.
Let me recommend you a report that Senator Pate has produced as a result of years. We were brought into the Senate on the same day in November of 2016. And Kim immediately started reaching out to senators, most of whom had never been in a prison, and is still to this day taking groups of senators into prisons across this country, and produced a report that I think is Senators Go to Jail. So I do recommend that for reading. We have time for closing comments, and then we're going to spend time upstairs for our reception. I want to say that many of you know each other in sort of clusters within this room. We have esteemed academics, esteemed diplomats, we have parliamentarians, we have civil society leaders, we have leaders of agencies that enable civil society to actually get things done. And we have change makers and from all of those sectors. Please spend time crossing over and getting to know somebody that maybe you haven't met before. I can assure you that it's a fabulous list. You're all fabulous, and we're hoping that you'll enjoy being able to be together with us upstairs. And so if I may now invite Susan for a closing comment, and then you, Pam, for your closing comment.
Well, thank you for being here. The historical nature of it is really moving to me. You can tell, although I am usually this way. I just feel very passionate about it, and like the historical context of relations between South Africa and Canada. The fact that you can have political relations, foreign relations, and diplomats, and then you can have grassroots people who have the power working together when it's needed. Okay, South Africa needs us right now. Okay, Palestine needs us. All right, Mexico needs us right now. And so we're always working on our issues, but to know that we have solidarity at the grassroots level, I think is exceptionally powerful. And I hope that we keep doing that because it's very needed right now. Thank you for allowing me to be part of this.
Yes, and Shireen and Kathy, thanks for the idea, and for everybody that came together with us this evening for this conversation. The reception is in what's called the Senator's Lounge. Typically, it's only senators that can go in there, but we are very happy to be able to share that space with everybody this evening. J.I., I don't know if we've got any directions for folks in terms of how you want to move to the reception.
I've got the main stairs and then help direct you around the hall.
Okay. Then this session, this opening session of Imagining Equality in Canada and South Africa, a joint venture of Carleton University, Wits University, and for tonight, the Senate of Canada is now adjourned, and we look forward to conversations upstairs. Thank you so much.